The Danish Gambit. White just begins to give up material as quickly as possible, beginning with pawn to d4, and then pawn e4 and pawn e5. The pawn will just go up to c3 after black takes, giving his opponent the opportunity to keep taking that material. The intention is for his opponent to take, but they are not required to. Not particularly concerned about black taking additional stuff. Bishop is here to c4. Bishop is here to b2 if black keeps taking. White suddenly has 2 pawns down in material, but his setup is quite aggressive, as you can see. This king side is being eyed by both of his bishops. None of black's pieces are used in the game. White has a very free lane for his queen to become engaged. Depending on whether he wants to be really aggressive or needs some safety, he can easily get his knights involved on either side of the board in the middle, castle queen side or king side. Therefore, Danish Gambit is undoubtedly one of the occasions where you will have numerous chances to play. One of my favorites, the Cochrane Gambit, comes in at number 6 on our list. Following pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and knight here to f3, these are very typical movements on both sides. White will typically reply with a knight to e5, followed by a pawn to d6, kicking this knight back if black attempts the Petrov defense, which is uncommon but occasionally seen. Usually, the knight returns to f3, after which we witness the knight take e4, and so on. However, I prefer aggressive openers, and this is a little boring. Therefore, White will actually play knight to f7 in the Cochrane Gambit rather than moving his knight back. He will now have to give up his knight too soon. Now, it appears that black will either lose his queen or his rook if he doesn't accept this material. He must accept this, but everything will work out just fine. In this role, this is what White want. White may essentially assault his opponent's king for the remainder of the game because he has 2 pawns in return for giving up a knight in material. The Scotch Gambit is the next aggressive opening on our list. Begins with pawn to e4, followed by pawn to e5. I adore openers with pawn e4, knight to f3, knight to c6, and finally pawn to d4. This is the game of Scotch. Someone came up with the Scotch Gambit, which makes the often slow and dull Scotch game much more engaging. White will therefore not take this material here on d4 after the pawn takes it. You know, you may envision a knight-on-knight exchange here, but White will play bishop here to c4, and he will launch a very, very powerful attack. So again, the Scotch Gambit, if you're definitely looking for a way to kind of spice up the Scotch game, this is definitely your opening. The King's Gambit is, you guessed it, the second aggressive opening on our list. My own favorite opening. Give away material by pawning to e4, e5, and then f4. It is undoubtedly excellent for both novices and seasoned players if you haven't played it before. Usually, the pawn moves from f4 to f3. I kind of play like this. You may play bishop here to c4 if you want to, but there are a lot of great lines. I'll stick with the King's Gambit, which is the Museo Gambit, because I want to discuss one of my favorites because it's also quite aggressive. The standard method for the King's Gambit is to play pawn to h4 if your opponent plays pawn to g5. When they push down, you play your knight to g5 and try to include your bishop. However, your opponent may not always play into this. However, an outpost on g5 is somewhat made possible by this pawn right here. All of that just doesn't matter to the Museo Gambit. It plays bishop here to c4 because it is constantly attempting to incorporate more pieces in the action. White doesn't care that the pawn will advance and assault this knight. White will essentially give up that material and head to the castle on the king side. The king side is suddenly somewhat weakened for black if you look at the setup after the pawn takes and the queen takes right here. Other than this meek pawn on f4, he has no pieces that are actually participating in the play. Suddenly, from White's point of view, he is castled, his queen and bishop are involved, and it will be quite difficult for black to maintain all of White's aggression. The Halloween Gambit will be the next aggressive opening that we examine. Although it is really dangerous, playing it is a lot of fun. Begins with a pawn on e4. If anyone is wondering why e4 occurs so frequently, it's because it gives the light-squared bishop the opportunity to involve the queen in the game. Many of the openers contain e4 since it is typically a much more aggressive opening, pawn to e5, followed by knight to c3, knight to c6, and finally knight to f3, in a manner similar to the four knights game. Additionally, the Latvian Gambit is knight-taking here on e5, which makes the video because it seems a little insane, which it is. Knight is assuming this position on e5, and the pawn will advance on d4. We simply go forward once again if the knight returns to c6. We can sort of make it return here. Extremely combative, always pressing, and essentially making black move his knights everywhere. Overall, white will be using his pawns to advance in an attempt to control the center and engage his bishop. Here is some support for his queen. It's undoubtedly an entertaining opening, and even though white lacks material, he can frequently recover it if black doesn't play flawlessly. The Latvian Gambit is our sole opening from black's point of view, and it will be the next aggressive opening we examine. I've started playing it more and more since it's a lot of fun to see your opponent's expression. It's a lot of fun to play, and they genuinely believe you have no idea what you're doing. You will see knight f3 constantly, therefore you will have enough of chances to play the Latvian Gambit. Pawn to e4 and pawn e5 are rather common. After that, you'll play pawn to f5. The opening was pretty insane. White can react to this in a variety of ways, particularly if they have never seen it before. They might do something really outlandish. Here, the Latvian Gambit is a very aggressive opening that opens up the king side. The bishop can be brought here to c5 in a variety of ways, give up material, including the queen or rook, if desired, and then assault this square on f2. The fried liver attack completes our list of the top aggressive openings. I had to include it on the list because it's so much fun. Knight to f6, gotta love the light-squared bishop in an aggressive opening, pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop here to c4. These are all incredibly common moves. White can play a variety of strategies, such as king casting, pawn pushing forward, knight to c3, and more. All of these strategies are acceptable yet dull. In order to prepare for knight taking here on f7, we play the fried liver attack, which involves knight here to g5. Additionally, you could play bishop here on f if you truly wanted to point 7. Overall, though, white wants to trade a lot of material off the board, get that king here to f7, move that queen into the game to assault if necessary, and simply pursue this king everywhere. I highly recommend it if you haven't already.